Alright, these are the more compressed version of the week 1 notes. So, with this 3D modeling and render, week 1, day 1. Today we're going to talk about the basics. Those basics involve getting to know a 3D package. One of the first things you're going to notice inside 3D package is the viewports. Every one of them has them, whether it's 3DSMax, which has its viewports like this, or Maya, which has its viewports arrayed like this, or a program like Unity, which has multiple different viewports. One of the first things you're going to need to know is how do you navigate inside of those viewports. So I'm going to come down here to my start menu. I'm going to type in 3DS Max, and I want to, we're just going to do 3DS, and I want to select 3ds Max 2021, and that's going to go ahead and launch the software. So while that's loading in the background, there you go, you can see the menu just popped up, 3ds Max 2021, that's going to start loading. There's multiple versions every year, the software updates. For the fall, we're going to be using 2021. Now I've already loaded this previously on my computer, so it tends to load up a little bit quicker, right? The first time you load it, it's going to take longer for the software to go ahead and launch. So here we can see 3ds Max is popping open. All right, it's going to take it a moment. One of the things that has popped up down here in my menu bar is an updates, right? So as a student, right, you're probably wondering, how do I get this software? As a student, you can make an account with Autodesk and you can download a free trial version of the software. You'll want to get 2021 because that's what we're going to be working in. When you get software, they do tend to update it, especially Autodesk software that gets updated every single year. You can see here that 3 weeks ago, they put out an update to 3ds Max 2021. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to update it. I'm not going to update it right now in the middle of my tutorial, but as soon as I'm done, I'm definitely going to update it. And you should stay up to date with the different updates because those are always going to go through and improve and fix bugs in the software. If I go over and click in 3ds Max, you see it has this very nice menu screen. You can uncheck down here at the bottom and that will get it to not pop up. The welcome screen gives you very interesting, useful information, like talking about the different parts of the screen, talk about how the mouse works, and talks about other features that we maybe don't use quite as often. So I'm going to close that. I'm going to minimize the updates. Now here's 3ds Max, and you can see that I have viewports just like I showed you in my slides previously. Right. If I hold my middle mouse button, I can pan. If I wheel my middle mouse button, right, and I'm scrolling it, that allows it to get larger and smaller. And if I click here on this little guy in the corner, that changes, right? That orbits around. I can kind of rotate. I'm just going to come click Orthographic here and click front. All right, so let's go back to those notes I had. So we're focusing in on viewports first, right? And one thing of importance is talk about the different types of viewports. Now you can see here I've written orthographic versus perspective. And the difference there is whether it's a 2D viewport or if it has vanishing points. I can illustrate that here in 3ds Max. This is my command panel. One thing I've done is after launching 3ds Max, you hover over the edge and you drag this bar over until you get 2 different panels here. This will be very useful because you'll be able to see more information when you're editing objects. Now, right now, all right, we're going to do something very simple. I'm going to come here to box. I'm going to click in my perspective view. Now I'm going to come back to box, keyboard entry, and I'm going to, under length, width, and height, enter a value of 100. Before I do that, let's go up here, customize, unit setup, and I'm going to do system unit setup. And I have 1 unit equals 1 centimeter. Now I've already gone in and done this inside my version of 3ds Max. Max will default to inches. Once you've changed it to centimeters and clicked OK, it will always work like that. And I'm going to leave it on generic units. Now you may be wondering why. Just like I had previously shown you that different software packages all have viewports, we're going to work consistently inside of centimeters. The reason for that is game engines usually work off of centimeters, where 1 unit equals 1 centimeters. And we're going to try and make our objects to a real world scale. And so if you're building things within that 1 centimeter scale for games, then your objects are going to work really well inside a game engine. So now here I am again, create box, keyboard entry. I leave X, Y, and Z as 0, and length, width, and height. I click create. And that makes a box. Now, in order to do this, remember, you're going to need to click on keyboard entry to expand that. All right, so I'm going to right click to get out of box creation. Now I'm just going to click Z in my viewport, and that'll center the object. And if I click on the different viewports and click Z, you'll see it does the same thing. Now, if your box comes in looking really dark, one thing you can do next to name and color, there's a little color swatch. You can select a different color there. Notice if I leave it on this dark blue, it's kind of hard to see. And so if I click on it, I can change the color of the wireframe inside there. Okay? So I'm going to come over here into perspective. I'm going to click on this little box here and see how it says front. Still says perspective here, but I'm looking at it from the front. That's what the view cube is telling me. I'm going to click on default shading and go down to wireframe. So now you can see the difference between the four different viewports. And really it's two differences. Perspective has vanishing points, right? So it actually is an object drawn in perspective. Things further away get smaller. Now here in the front, top, and left, we are looking at a box. And so the lines, the edges that make up the height here in the top, those lines are perpendicular, right? I mean, they go straight away from these other edges. And so you don't see them, right, in this two-dimensional view. Now the reason for this and why there are orthographic versus perspective has to do with modeling, right? And the genesis of 3D software, which was for computer-aided drafting, or CAD is what it was referred to at the time. Going through and creating blueprints for objects, designing objects in this orthographic, this two-dimensional view. And so you can see a front, a top, a left side, as well as a back, right? This plane, again, it's got a side view, a front, and a top. All of these different objects have these different views, and think of it as blueprints, right? Now, a lot of times, we've evolved to the place where you can find blueprints online and you could utilize those to model objects. Like in this case, here's an X-wing, and I've set up the front view, the right view, and the front view is, or I'm sorry, top, front, and right, in order to model my object to make it match those dimensions and all those different viewports. And in perspective, you can see the completed model as it's being constructed. The same with this spinner from Blade Runner, the top, the front, and the right, and then there's my 3D object. All right? And so that's kind of where those come from. One thing, another example I could show you is if I come in here to a teapot, and under keyboard entry, I'm just going to add a value of 50 and hit create. You can see there's the teapot. I right click to get out of create mode. You can see front, left, top view, and here's perspective, where if I click on my view cube, I can orbit around to kind of see that teapot right there. Now there are additional controls down here at the bottom that allow you to navigate in the viewport. Things like this magnifying glass, which allow me to zoom in and out, as well as field of view, which in perspective will adjust how wide the field of view is. The more wide the field of view, the more you're really zooming in on something. Right? You're not actually moving through space, whereas zoom here actually is moving you through 3D space. You can kind of see how the perspective changes as you move. Do the same thing in the front view, and those controls change. Zoom still works, but now you have a nice region select where I can click and drag, and I'll zoom into that one spot. That's another difference between the two-dimensional orthographic views as well as perspective. Another way to see that is if I use the view cube here in the front view, now it says orthographic because this is a two-dimensional view still. I'm going to right-click to get out of that zoom mode. But now you can see, again, this is a two-dimensional view here. So I'm just going to come back to front. All right. So we're getting a lot of information out here. Let's go back to the notes. So viewport controls, we've kind of been talking about this as we go. I do have a document that'll be posted that has a number of shortcuts on it, especially ones for how you can navigate inside the viewports. Things like Alt-W, right? Alt-W will make the viewports larger or smaller. That's also the bottom rightmost button there. Click on that, and that'll make the viewport larger or smaller. The button above it will allow you to zoom in on whatever is selected currently. I can't click on those at the moment, unfortunately, because the way my recording software is, it parks the controls right down there. But Z will zoom in on everything, what you currently have selected inside of the viewport. All right. Once you have an object, if you don't want that object, you can just click delete. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the display. This first control here, this is going to be your utilities options. Also things like turning the grid on and off. See, it says show grid, and there's a G. If there's a little letter on the side, that's telling you that there's a shortcut. The same for maximize viewport. So if you just hit Alt W, that'll make that larger or smaller, or just hitting G will turn the grid on and off. This next view controls what type of viewport you have, whether it's perspective or orthographic. See how it went 2D, no more perspective, or back to perspective. And then you have named viewport types. Next to that, we control the type of shading, like how things are shaded. I find that standard tends to be the most useful inside of there. We'll probably use that one the least. And then here, this guy at the end, this is incredibly useful because right now I'm in wireframe override. If I click default shading, now I can see the surface. When you're in default shading, you can also turn on edged faces so that now you can kind of see the little lines that make up the corners. Why don't I make a sphere? So I'm in create, I clicked on sphere, and I'm just going to click and drag here in the top viewport on the side. Then right click 2 times to get out of that. And now, when I click a negative space, you see the sphere, you can see the lines on the side. That's because I've turned on edged faces. And you'll want to keep that on, right? Because you want to see how complex your objects are. Right, so I can turn that on and off. Now, nice shortcut is F3. F3 toggles shaded and wireframe. And when you're shaded, F4 will toggle edged faces. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is making stuff. Now, you've seen me make a number of different things. Now, the images you see here inside are from a previous version of the software. I'll get these updated before the class starts. So when you look at the actual doc, those will be updated. So when you start working in a 3D package, you're going to want to know, how do I make the raw materials, the building blocks of 3D objects? In this case, these are standard primitives inside 3DSMax, so we're going to go to create. And so you can click on any number of these objects, and that's going to pop open what's called rollouts. So why don't we take a look here at what those are. So I'm going to come over here. And so I'm going to click on these guys and delete them. And now if I come here to sphere, I've clicked on sphere. You can see there's all my information. If I just click and drag, I make a sphere. And it's going to make it on the surface of this perspective plane. I can make as many as I want, and I'm always going to make them until I get out of creation mode. And I do that by right-clicking. Now, other objects are going to be a little bit more complicated to make than a sphere. So I'm going to hold my middle mouse button, move over to the side. I'm going to make a box. If I click and drag, I'm defining the base of the box. And then when I release, I'm not holding any button on my mouse, and I'm defining how tall it is. So one thing to keep in mind is that when you go in and you create your objects, don't worry about making the perfect sphere or the perfect box. Because as soon as you've made those objects, you can go to the next panel, which is Modify. And Modify allows you to go in, I'm zooming out with my middle mouse button and my middle mouse wheel to kind of center. Here I am, I'm in Modify. It says I'm on box 01, that's its color. And it says box, and then there you can see the parameters, and I can adjust these. I could type in a value of 50, hit tab on my keyboard, enter another 50, tab and another 50. Now I have a very simple box sitting out here in the world. Now, in addition to that, there's other things, like I can say how many segments I want my box to be. And you can see that it's adding additional edges to it. All right. Same thing if I want to make another object. Let's go back to create. I'm going to make a cylinder. Now you'll see that parameters are right here. So I could go in and I could actually start entering values here, or I can just make raw material and then go to create, or I'm sorry, go to modify and change that. Maybe I want to have 10 height segments, and maybe I want to actually have 2 cap segments here. All right. Maybe I want it to have less sides. Maybe I'll take that down to 6. Maybe instead I want to bring the cap down. Maybe I want it to be a little bit thinner. What I'm doing is I'm clicking and I'm dragging on these numbers in order to adjust their size. Okay. Now there's another way to create objects, and that is by using what's called keyboard entry. I'm going to click and expand this rollout. I'm going to type in a radius of 50 and hit create here in perspective, and now at 0, 0, 0 in the world origin, there's now a sphere that is 50, has a radius of 50 units. And so you'll see in my various tutorials I do like to use keyboard entry quite a lot. All right. So now we have these very basic building blocks. All right. And that's where I'm going to stop this tutorial and move on to the next separate tutorial from there. But this is kind of the basics of going through and making objects. All right. And so why don't we, before I do that, let's just go through. We'll make each one of these. I'm going to make a box. Instead of make a box, I click and drag in perspective and release. And notice, because I had previously entered values of 3, 3, 3, this box has it. Sphere, I just click and drag. Cylinder, if I click and drag, that makes the radius of the top, and now I'm adjusting its height. Similar to how you define the base of a box and then create its height. Again, the cylinder, it's the same way. I went ahead and I changed my number of sides and as well as my height segments. And so now every object I make is going to have those same values. So why don't I get this back to the default? 18 sides and 5 height. There we go. Taurus is an interesting one. Just holding my middle mouse wheel to pan. I click and drag to create that shape. And that creates the overall radius of it. And now as I drag, I'm saying how thick is that donut. All right. Teapot, you just click and drag. Text plus, we're going to skip over. That's for creating text. A cone, you define a base, you define height, and then you define the height of the top of the cone. All right. Tube, you define the base of it, and then you do what's the inside of that tube, and then create the height. All right. Pyramid, right? It's just like a box. Define that outer base of it, release, and then you just say how tall. And then a plane. A plane is just a flat surface. There we go. And any one of these, after we've created them, we go to modify, and now we can change their length and width segments. All right, so that's the basics. That's where we're going to go. I think one last thing is moving stuff, transforms. And so now that I've made objects, how do I move them around in the world? And you can see there's this thing called a transform gizmo. So I click, and if I hover over certain sides, you can see how it changed. This is going to move it. Let's click Z in all of our viewports with nothing selected. It's going to zoom out. So now I can move stuff here in my two-dimensional view if I want to go through and line everything up. You see how it's pretty easy to line things up here in the top, because I can just see there's this line, which represents the x-axis. I'm just going to line everything up on it. I don't want this plane. I'm going to click delete, get rid of them. If I tried to line up all my objects out here in world space, it'd be a little bit trickier. I'm going to orbit around. There's all my objects. So here we go. Select my object, and you can see I was grabbing this handle here, right? If I right-click to make perspective active, I can switch to just the Z and move that up and down. Nothing selected. Click front and hit Z, top and hit Z, left and hit Z. There we go. I'm going to hit G in all these views to turn off the grid. All right, so now transforms. If I grab the handle, that allows me to move them around. If I want to move it in one specific direction, I can just grab that specific axis that highlights it yellow, or I could grab the kind of the handle between the two, which let's do that here, orbit around a little bit. I can grab the handle, so now it's just moving along the Y and X. And you know which axis, right? You can see the axis in the corner. All right. Now I can also do other things. If I right click, I can go into rotate. Also up here at the top, move, rotate, and scale. QWER are select, move, rotate, and scale on your keyboard. So if I go into rotate, it's the same thing. I can rotate objects. I do find if I come up here, these are world snaps. I tend to avoid this initial one, but this guy here, this angle snap, if I turn that on, that rotates everything at 5-degree increments, and it also gives me this nice readout. So I'm going to rotate him 90 degrees, and then another 90 degrees here, and that's how I can go in and rotate. I was rotating him on one specific axis by highlighting it. I could grab just the control in the middle, and this gives me complete freedom to rotate this object around. If I go into scale, I can grab an object and I can scale it. Now if I grab the triangle in the middle, that's going to be what we call uniform. If I get two edges on the outside, it's going to scale only along those two. If I grab one axis, it's going to scale it only on that one axis. All right. This is uniform scale, grabbing it in the center. There's other types. If I click and hold, this is non-uniform. This will, with the transform gizmo, it kind of made that a little less useful. The very bottom option here is squash and stretch. So watch, if I scale this guy up in Z or up in Y, you'll see how he gets a lot thinner or he squishes out. If you're familiar with the principles of animation, you got squash and stretch, right? And so that's where that comes in. So if you're going to use keyboard shortcuts, watch how if I hit R, it's going to change that scale type each time I click on that. All right. So a lot of these shortcuts I'm going to have, there's on the Google Classroom, there's going to be a general notes folder, and there will be a shortcut sheet. You can see those inside of there. All right. So there you go. That's kind of the basic introduction of how to use the tools in 3ds Max, creating primitives and adjusting their size and transforming them. Those are the basics you're going to need in any 3D software.